Deputy Mike Hookham. 2 minutes, take the floor, please.
Well, here we have in black and white that dangerous fantasy Nick Clegg tried to trick voters with in 2014 when he said there were no plans for an EU military. Whilst the UK government dithers over invoking Article 50 and pro-EU MPs and Lords plot to overturn the will of the people, the EU is busy putting in place plans to spend British taxpayers' money on an EU military which many here will hope replaces NATO. Except this scheme will not just focus on martial law, but wants to encroach on civil liberties. And I would like to bring to MEPs' attention that the fact that this report wants EU troops to combat subversion. Subversion actually covers everything from threats to the state to political opposition, books, films and even comedians. It is an attack on free speech, and because it's from a place like this, an attack on those who oppose the EU project. This report has huge implications for the sovereignty of the UK and its ability to control its own military, which must serve as motivation for all Brexiteers and those who believe in democracy to ensure the will of the people is served. We cannot afford to be trapped in this bloc which so shamelessly uses crises of its own making, such as the migrant crisis, to further its own political aims. The terrorist attacks in Brussels and Paris have had direct links to the stupidity of the EU's migrant policy, which, had it been carried out by an organisation with any level of accountability, would have seen senior figures being unceremoniously fired. To make the most of this opportunity, we need to invoke Article 50 as soon as possible and revitalise the UK armed forces, including an increase in defence spending and investment in our troops and in the industries needed to have a strong engineering and defence sector in the UK.
On behalf of the ECR Group, Deputy Geoffrey Van Orden, 1.5 minutes, take the floor, please.
Chairman, I'm tempted to spend my time replying to Johan's question about what went wrong with the EU. Well, maybe not listening to our citizens, maybe the euro, maybe migration policy. What about misguided notions about EU defence? The security and credibility of the West rests on the combined strength of the democracies. We always knew that whoever became the next President of the United States, he or she would have demanded that the Europeans carry more of the defence burden. But I would suggest that this is done by the nations spending more on defence and showing more capability and revitalising the NATO alliance, not creating alternative structures. Unlike the EU, NATO is an intergovernmental organisation. It doesn't undermine national sovereignty. And above all, it has the enormous advantage of binding the United States to the security of Europe. That's the great combined power that our potential enemies take seriously. Russia would be delighted if Europe was to develop its so-called strategic autonomy, separated from the United States. I mean, what's that all about? It's a dangerous fallacy for the European Union to imagine, and I'm quoting here from the report, that it can intervene across the whole spectrum of crisis management. That includes war fighting, by the way, and that the EU should aim for a common defence. I thought you said you weren't aiming for collective defence. Common defence, it's the same thing, which immediately casts doubt on the continued relevance of NATO. How on earth would the EU protect its non-NATO members? It's just disingenuous for the EU to talk about complementarity with NATO when the aim is to set up a different military structure. Thank you, Mr. President. I could say a lot more.
Thank you.
There we are. Well, as you all pat yourselves on the back for creating a combined EU army, I, for one, am becoming increasingly concerned. With great military power comes great responsibility. While the EU may describe itself as a diplomatic superpower, it's nothing of the kind. You only need to look at the mess the EU has created in Turkey to see that this institution does not have the experience or the maturity to be a superpower. And with a superpower army must come superpower defence budget. My question is, who is going to pay? As part of Brexit, the British people voted to retain the UK armed forces intact, free of the EU army. So I would be loath to see one penny of British taxpayers' money being used to fund the EU's new defence agenda. That is why I am calling for the UK to be exempt from all new spending in this area. The British people demand it.
Dámy a pánové.
Ladies and gentlemen, in a while you want to vote that the EU is the greatest success in history. But I think that the EU is a big mistake, and it's just an arrogant attempt to centrally organize our continent. Again, you want to vote on the wording that the EU is the greatest economic power. But I think that too much bureaucracy has simply put a stop to real growth and has led some countries to the brink of bankruptcy. Again, you want to say that the EU brings peace, prosperity and stability, but according to my opinion, EU diplomacy has initiated the crisis in Ukraine, and we have only brought to Europe instability, terror and 1 million illegal migrants. Now again, you want to vote on the creation of the European army, a headquarters, a military council and military planning. But when I look around and see the chaos 5 years ago of a few countries of the EU in Libya, their action there, when I see how EU diplomacy incited a crisis in Ukraine, and what you did to Central European countries as far as quotas are concerned, I really fear what might happen when we create EU army. So I will vote against, and I ask you to do the same.
Thank you, Madam President. I have to say that the concept of cooperation amongst EU member states is ridiculous when you only have to look at the frequent incursions. Only yesterday, another Spanish naval incursion into Gibraltarian waters. I have a consistent wariness of the development of EU common defence and foreign affairs. This place consistently talks about supporting and cooperating with NATO. I call it undermining and replacing. Why would we give up a tried and tested alliance system in NATO in the name of an EU experiment? My belief is no better expressed than in this report. Although member states make a 2% of GDP defence spending commitment to NATO, most don't, and it's only through accounting trickery that my own country does. The development of EU military ambitions directly challenges the neutral stance of Sweden, the Republic of Ireland and Austria, and if the EU won't comprehend that, then your ambitions for ever closer union at all levels are eventually bound to fail. But of course, you'll only blame someone else when that eventuality happens. Thank you.
Thank you. Deputy Dan Hannan, 1 minute, take the floor, please.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. No one is talking about a militarised EU. We kept being told it 100 times, 1,000 times during our campaign. And as we just heard my comrade Lynn Boyle from the Communist Group say, the other member states immediately responded to Brexit with precisely this proposal for militarisation. Well, good luck. I mean, we're not going to be around, but we're still going to be allies, right? During our referendum campaign, a decision was made to deploy British troops to the defence of your country, Poland and Estonia, and it was not criticised on any side. And nobody tried to press it into the arguments about the referendum because we understand that we still have a vested interest, an immediate interest, in the prosperity and security of our European friends. We want to be good neighbours, we want to be dependable partners, but our relationship from now on is going to be based on alliance, not assimilation.
Thank you. Deputy Jonathan Arnott, take the floor, please.
Thank you. I am reminded, Mr. President, of the famous duck test. If it looks like a duck, if it swims like a duck, and it quacks like a duck, then it's probably a duck. Now, Commissioner Mogherini has told us that there are no plans for an EU army. Soldiers, of course, fighting under the EU flag, yes. EU battle groups, yes. EU headquarters, yes. But no EU army. I suspect that this somewhat fails the duck test.
Thank you. Dziękuję bardzo, panie pośle.
Thank you very much.